The first letter arrived on a cold October morning, carried by a gust of wind that rattled the church's warped shutters. The pastor found it resting on the doorstep, smudged with soot as if dragged through a dying fire. He would have dismissed it as another strange Ozark superstition, if not for the trembling handwriting that seemed to pulse on the page. The note warned of voices whispering from the woods behind Bear Hollow Ridge, voices that called the writer by name, and voices that would not let her sleep. It was signed only with 2 initials, CM, but something in the way the letters curled felt strangely familiar, like a memory he was not supposed to have. Before he could question it, the elder snatched the letter from his hands, read it once, and declared it the work of backwoods witchery. He watched them toss it into the stove's open mouth, flames swallowing the words before he could trace them again. Yet the smoke that rose smelled less like paper and more like something older, something damp and wild. The elders ordered him to forget it, but he could not forget the sound the paper made, like a small voice choking mid-sentence. The second letter arrived at dawn the next day, slipped to him by a trembling choir girl who said she found it pinned to the church door. This one spoke of lights drifting through the trees at night and footsteps that circled a lonely cabin long after the world slept. The writer begged for anyone who still remembered the truth to come before the voices grew bold enough to leave the woods. The name came in the third letter, scrawled at the bottom as if the writer hesitated even to write it, McCrae. The McCrae Sisters, the pair the town claimed had died in a cabin fire years ago. Their ashes were said to be buried somewhere beyond Bearcut Creek. Their story was whispered only in warnings. And yet the letters insisted they were alive, afraid, and hunted not by a creature of the woods but by the very church that condemned their memories to smoke. By the time he stood at the edge of Bear Hollow Ridge, the Missouri wind carrying a faint chorus of whispering through the burnt orange leaves, the pastor realized something terrible. The letters were not only pleas for help. They were a trail, leading him deep into a place where stories were buried alive, and where the woods themselves seemed eager to tell the parts the church had tried so hard to burn. Key point number 1 describes the moment the first letter enters the story, quietly, mysteriously, and with a sense of intrusion that feels almost supernatural. The pastor finds it on a cold October morning, but what unsettles him most isn't the letter itself, it's how it arrives. There is no knock, no shadow on the steps, no footprints in the dirt outside the church. Instead, a sudden gust of wind rattles the warped shutters, carrying with it a faint smell of smoke, and when the pastor opens the door, the envelope is simply there, placed with a care that feels deliberate. The soot smudges along its edges hint that it passed through fire or ruin before reaching him, yet the paper remains intact, as if whatever tried to burn it was unable to finish the job. This small contradiction sets the tone for everything that follows, suggesting that the letter has survived something hostile or forbidden. Inside, the handwriting trembles in uneven strokes, not from clumsiness but from fear so intense it shakes the ink. The pastor senses this instantly, even before he reads the words fully. The message speaks of voices in the woods near Bear Hollow Ridge, voices that whisper at night and call out to the writer by name. There is no attempt to sound logical or brave. The letter reads like a confession written in haste, equal parts desperation and terror. The signature is nothing but 2 letters, CM, a cryptic ending that should mean nothing, yet the shape of those initials lingers in the pastor's mind. He cannot explain why. It feels like something he has seen long ago, something buried, something the church never talked about but never truly forgot. The church elders dismiss the letter immediately. Their reaction is too quick, too rehearsed, and far too forceful for such a small piece of paper. They snatch it from him, label it witchcraft, and feed it to the stove within seconds, as though the words themselves pose a threat. The flames swallow the ink, but the smoke rises with an odor that does not belong to paper. Instead of the dry, familiar scent, it carries a damp, earthy undertone, like moss pulled from the forest floor after decades of being hidden from sunlight. The pastor watches this in silence, struggling with a sensation he cannot name. The letter has been destroyed, yet its message remains, etched into his thoughts. The elders tell him to forget, to move on, to let the matter die, but their urgency only strengthens his suspicion that they knew something long before he opened that envelope, and that the arrival of CM's letter is not the beginning of the story at all but the moment the truth finally claws its way back into the light. Key point number 2 centers on the church's reaction, a response so swift and aggressive that it exposes far more than the elders ever intended. When the pastor presents the soot-stained letter, expecting concern or at least curiosity, he instead witnesses a kind of rigid fear disguised as authority. The elders barely skim the trembling handwriting before declaring the message, fabricated witchcraft, a phrase that feels rehearsed, almost as if they've been waiting for a moment like this to happen again. They do not question who CM might be, how the letter arrived without footsteps, or why the writer seems convinced that danger is closing in around her. Their lack of interest is too sharp, too deliberate. What unsettles the pastor is not their dismissal but the urgency with which they insist the letter must be destroyed, as though letting it remain in the room for even a few minutes might invite something back into their sacred space. Their hands move quickly, more like men extinguishing a spark before it ignites than men evaluating a plea for help. They toss the letter into the stove without ceremony, ignoring the pastor's attempt to speak. But when the flames catch, the church elders do not look relieved. Instead, they watch the fire with tight jaws and narrowed eyes, as if making sure the words can never return. The letter curls, shrivels, and turns to ash, and in that moment, the pastor notices the elders exchange a silent glance, one heavy with something unspoken, recognition, perhaps, or dread. It is the kind of look shared by people who have buried secrets and built walls around them. Their insistence that the pastor forget what he saw raises more questions than answers. They warn him not to mention the letter to anyone, claiming it was sent to tempt the weak-minded, but their reasoning is hollow. They refuse to let him finish describing the contents or ask why the writer's initials feel familiar. Their reaction suggests that the letter is not an odd occurrence but a repeating echo, something they encountered before and failed, or refused, to confront. The more they command silence, the more the pastor senses that they are protecting themselves rather than the congregation. What lingers most is the disconnect between their words and their faces. They speak with authority, yet their eyes betray a flicker of fear, a fear not of witchcraft but of memory. The pastor leaves the room with the distinct impression that the elders recognized the handwriting the moment they saw it. Their attempt to smother the letter in flames only deepens his suspicion that it carried a truth the church once tried hard to bury and that its arrival signals the unraveling of a past they hoped would never claw its way back. Key point number 3 marks the moment the mystery refuses to stay buried, returning more boldly and more publicly than before. After the elders burn the first letter and command silence, the pastor tries to obey, though the trembling handwriting and desperate tone linger in his mind. He wakes the next morning unsettled, convinced the matter should have ended with the flames. But at dawn, as the frost still clings to the church windows, a timid knock breaks the stillness. When he opens the door, he finds not an elder or messenger but a young choir girl, trembling as if afraid to be seen. She holds an envelope between her fingers, its corners slightly bent, its flap sealed not with wax but with what looks like damp earth. Her eyes dart toward the shadows near the churchyard as if watching for something that might follow her. She explains that she found the letter pinned to the church door with a rusted nail, driven into the wood at such a height she could not imagine any ordinary person placing it there without being noticed. She swears she arrived before sunrise and that no one else was around. The pastor believes her, though he cannot understand how the letter arrived without waking anyone or leaving any trace on the dew-covered steps. The second letter feels colder, as if whatever carried it traveled through the night with intention and urgency. When he removes the nail, a faint whisper seems to slip through the crack of the door, so soft he almost convinces himself he imagined it. The message inside is harsher, written with a frantic hand that digs deep into the paper. This time the writer describes wandering lights weaving between the trees near Bear Hollow Ridge, lights that appear at the same hour every night and move in patterns too purposeful to be natural. She speaks of footsteps circling her cabin long after midnight, growing closer with each passing night, stopping only when she whispers prayers she no longer believes will protect her. There is no mention of who or what lurks outside, only the plea that someone from the church come before the voices grow confident enough to step out of the darkness. What chills the pastor most is the subtle shift in tone. The writer is no longer pleading but warning, as though she knows her time is shrinking. The crisp morning air seems to thicken as he reads, carrying with it an unspoken message. The burning of the first letter had not erased the truth. It had provoked it. This second letter, pinned brazenly to the church door, is a declaration that whatever is happening at Bear Hollow Ridge will not be silenced. And for the first time, the pastor feels the story pulling him in, insisting that he look beyond the church walls and into the woods where the whispers are beginning to take form. Key point number 4 marks the moment the mystery finally gives a name to the fear that has been circling the edges of the story. Until now, the pastor has only seen initials at the bottom of the first letter, CM, and the second letter offers no signature at all, only frantic warnings of lights, footsteps, and voices. But when the third letter appears, delivered with the same eerie silence as the others, the writer signs her full name, though the ink seems to fade as if resisting the truth being revealed. When the pastor reads the name, McCrae, a cold recognition moves through him, something that feels like memory but sits just outside his reach. The McCrae sisters were spoken of once in hushed voices years ago, before the church erased their story and replaced it with a single, tidy explanation: they died in a cabin fire during a violent storm. Their graves were said to lie somewhere beyond Bearcut Creek, marked with simple wooden crosses that disappeared over time. No one questioned this version of events, not because it was convincing, but because questioning was discouraged. The third letter changes everything. The writer claims she and her sister survived the fire, though they were never meant to. She describes how the church insisted they remain hidden, how the elders demanded their silence in exchange for supposed protection, and how that protection turned into confinement deep in the woods. She never states outright why the church feared them, but her words carry the weight of someone who has lived under a sentence without ever being told the crime. The tone of this letter is different, not desperate like the first, not warning like the second, but heavy, as though the writer knows she is revealing something forbidden. The pastor realizes that the reason the elders reacted so violently to the first letter was because they recognized the handwriting immediately. The destruction of the letter was not an attempt to stop a rumor but to hide a truth they once buried with their own hands. The McCrae sisters were not ghosts from folklore, not tragic victims of fire, but living women whose existence the church had tried to erase. The letters arriving now mean that something has gone wrong in their confinement, something serious enough that they believe the pastor is the only one who might listen. What unsettles him most is the simplicity of the signature, Catherine McCrae. The name brings back a flicker of a childhood memory, a girl with quiet eyes who rarely spoke during Sunday services, a girl who vanished one winter and was never mentioned again. Suddenly the soot on the first envelope, the damp dirt sealing the second, and the frantic warning in the third form a pattern he can no longer ignore. The truth is resurfacing, and the McCrae sisters are calling out not for rescue but for recognition, forcing the pastor to confront the fact that the past he trusted was shaped by fire, fear, and silence. Key point number 5 delves into the buried past of the McCrae family, a history the church once smothered beneath warnings, half-truths, and selective silence. As the pastor begins searching for any record of the sisters, he realizes how meticulously their names had been removed from ledgers, attendance books, even burial registries. It is as if the town had been instructed to forget them, not simply as individuals but as a family line. Yet old stories have a way of clinging to places, especially in the isolated stretches of the Missouri Ozarks, and fragments of the McCrae history still linger in the memories of those too old, too stubborn, or too haunted to forget. When the pastor speaks quietly with the oldest residents, the kind who sit near their fireplaces long after dark, he hears the same whispered phrase repeated with unease: the McCrae kin were listeners. It is not meant as a compliment. In the language of the Ridge folk, a listener is someone who hears things that should remain unspoken, someone who pays attention to the woods when everyone else knows to keep their head down and their ears closed. According to these scraps of memory, the McCrae family had lived on the edge of the forest for generations, and the woods around their homestead were said to behave strangely. Travelers claimed to hear murmurs drifting through the trees at night, footsteps where no people walked, and lights flickering between trunks like silent lanterns carried by invisible hands. Most families avoided that stretch of land, but the McCraes did not. They lived with the forest, not apart from it, and the sisters, Catherine and Mara, were said to be the most attuned of them all. As children, they spoke softly about sounds no one else heard. As young women, they walked the ridge at dusk without lanterns and returned with distant eyes, as if they carried back pieces of the dark. The church, which had always battled superstition in the region, viewed the McCrae sisters with a cautious kind of hostility. Rumors grew that they practiced strange rituals or whispered to shadows. None of these claims had proof, yet the church used them to justify ever-tightening control over the family. The pastor discovers through hesitant confessions that the church elders once visited the McCrae cabin frequently under the pretense of prayer, though their real aim seemed to be watching, listening, and ensuring the sisters did not stray from the boundary set for them. When the supposed fire killed the family, no one questioned the story because the church framed the tragedy as divine correction, a cleansing of a tainted lineage. Now, reading the letters in the dim light of his study, the pastor begins to see that the past was not shaped by divine hand but by human fear. The whispers attributed to the McCrae sisters were not signs of darkness but of knowledge that threatened the church's hold over the community. Their history, once hidden under ashes and warnings, reveals a pattern of attempts to silence them. This makes the new letters more disturbing, for they suggest that the voices in the woods were never the danger was the people determined to keep the sisters quiet. Key point number 6 follows the pastor's growing unease as he decides to confront the place the letters keep circling back to, the ridge where the original McCrae cabin supposedly burned. Despite the elders' warnings and the church's insistence that the matter is closed, the pastor feels the weight of the sisters' words pressing against him with the same quiet persistence as the whispers described in their letters. He finally convinces one of the younger deacons to accompany him, though the man agrees only after repeated assurances that they will return before dark. Wordlessly, they set off toward Bear Hollow Ridge, carrying nothing more than a lantern, a Bible, and the third letter tucked inside the pastor's coat. The journey itself feels heavy, as if the woods sense their arrival. The deeper they walk, the quieter everything becomes. No birds call, no wind stirs, and even the dry leaves beneath their boots seem to muffle themselves. When they reach the site where the McCrae cabin once stood, the pastor expects to feel relieved at simply seeing the truth for himself, but standing among the charred remains, relief is the last thing that touches him. The foundation is barely visible beneath overgrown vines, and the air is unnaturally cold, as though the ground still remembers the night flames consumed it. For a long moment, neither man speaks. The silence feels watchful. As the pastor steps forward, the lantern light flickers in a way that is not caused by wind. It dims as if something unseen is passing between the flame and the air itself. The pastor crouches near a piece of blackened timber and notices that the burn marks spread outward in strange, uneven patterns, not consistent with a typical cabin fire. He reaches out to touch the wood, and the moment his fingers brush the surface, a soft sound rises from the trees behind him. It is faint at first, like leaves rustling far away, but soon it takes on the shape of whispers, layered, overlapping, coming not from one direction but from all sides. The deacon stiffens, gripping the lantern so tightly the metal creaks in his hand. He whispers a prayer under his breath, but the whispers threading through the trees seem to respond, growing clearer, closer, almost forming words neither of them wants to hear. The pastor tries to tell himself it is only the wind, but the cadence is wrong. The forest feels alive in a way that suggests awareness, as though it recognizes him. Each whisper rises and falls in a rhythm that mirrors breath. The deacon urges him to leave, voice trembling, but the pastor stands frozen, listening. For an instant, he thinks he hears a name carried on the air, faint, unfinished, but unmistakably human. The letter's warnings take on shape in the darkness. Whatever haunts the ridge is not imagination, nor superstition, nor the fading memory of a fire. Something is still there, waiting, and the pastor understands with chilling clarity that he has stepped into a place where the past was never buried at all. Key point number 7 reveals the moment when the mystery shifts from suggestion to undeniable reality. After hearing the whispers in the ruins of the burned cabin, the pastor feels an instinctive pull deeper into the woods, a pull he cannot logically explain. The deacon pleads for them to turn back, insisting that no good can come from wandering further into the forest at dusk, but the pastor is drawn by something he cannot name, a faint glimmer between the trees, a sense that the letters are leading him somewhere specific. The path grows narrow and uneven, tangled with roots that seem to clutch at their boots. The air carries a strange weight, as if the forest itself is holding its breath. Even the deacon's lantern struggles to cast a steady beam, flickering in long, anxious tremors. As they press on, the woods begin to change subtly. The trees stand closer together, their trunks dark and unnaturally straight, like silent sentinels guarding a threshold. None of this matches the pastor's memories of the area, nor the maps the church keeps. Then, as they turn toward a ridge the pastor has never seen before, he notices something jarring. There is a faint trail, not made by animals, but by footsteps, narrow, light, and recent. The deacon swears he sees a figure vanish behind a tree, though the pastor catches only a flutter of movement, like cloth slipping out of sight. The forest feels inhabited, but not by anything the town has ever spoken of. When they reach a clearing, the pastor stops so abruptly the deacon almost collides with him. There, hidden beneath the heavy canopy of moss and shadow, stands a cabin. Not the burned ruin they left behind, but a second structure, intact, old, and built in the same style as the original McCrae homestead. Yet this cabin appears on no record, no land deed, no church document. It is as if it was deliberately omitted from every trace of the town's history. The wood is darkened with age, but not decay. The windows are shuttered, though faint lines of light pulse through the cracks, as if someone is moving inside with a lantern of their own. What chills the pastor most is the unnatural stillness surrounding it. No insects hum. No leaves shift. It feels like stepping into a memory preserved too perfectly, untouched by time or weather. The deacon refuses to go nearer, insisting that no one has lived here for decades and that they should not disturb whatever lingers. But the pastor feels the pull again, stronger now, almost like a voice inside his chest urging him to step forward. The letters had spoken of a place where the sisters waited, where voices circled the walls at night and footsteps never retreated. This cabin, hidden from every map yet undeniably alive with presence, feels like the heart of everything the church wanted forgotten. The pastor realizes that the story he thought he was uncovering has been watching him in return, drawing him toward a truth sealed far from daylight and closer to the whispering dark. Key point number 8 marks the discovery inside the hidden cabin, a moment that transforms the mystery from a haunting series of warnings into a chilling archive of truth. When the pastor finally steps across the threshold, the air inside feels heavier than the woods outside, as though the cabin has been sealed for years, holding its breath in the dark. Dust hangs in the lantern light, yet nothing inside appears abandoned. The furniture is sparse but orderly, the floor swept, and a faint scent of herbs lingers, something familiar yet impossible to place. The deacon refuses to cross the doorway, muttering that the place feels wrong, but the pastor walks farther in, drawn by the stillness that seems to hum beneath the silence. On a small table near the back wall sits a wooden box, its lid carved with simple geometric patterns, but scratched over in places as if someone tried to remove them. The pastor hesitates before touching it. The wood is cool, almost cold, as though it has absorbed years of fear. When he lifts the lid, he finds dozens of letters tied with twine, their edges yellowed but the ink startlingly clear, as if someone had written them only days ago. The sheer number of letters startles him. These are not occasional messages but a continuous plea, a long thread of communication that was never delivered. Some are dated from years after the supposed death of the McCrae sisters, proving that the church's story was not just incomplete but deliberately false. As he flips through them, a terrible pattern emerges. The earliest letters describe loneliness, confusion, and a promise from the church that the sisters would be protected in exchange for staying out of sight. But the tone changes as the years go on. The writing grows frantic, the letters shorter, the warnings sharper. They describe nights when something circled the cabin for hours, tapping on windows, brushing against the walls, whispering in voices that mimicked human speech but sounded hollow and layered, as if spoken through water or wind. Other letters describe men from the church, elders he recognizes, visiting the cabin not to offer comfort but to deliver threats, reminding the sisters of what would happen if they tried to leave. The most unsettling letters are ones that mention a second box buried under the cabin floor, a box the pastor does not see anywhere in the room. These letters hint that the box holds items the church feared, objects tied to the McCrae family's past and the woods surrounding them. Items someone wanted destroyed. As he reads, the pastor hears the deacon shift nervously at the doorway, whispering that the forest outside feels like it's listening. The pastor continues reading, heart pounding, realizing that every letter was begging for help long before he ever knew they existed. This hidden cabin is not just a place of refuge, it is a vault of truth the church tried to erase, a sealed chamber where fear was documented again and again in ink that refused to fade. And now, by opening the box, the pastor has stepped directly into the story the letters were trying to guide him toward, a story waiting in the shadows for someone to finally face it. Key point number 9 centers on the final letter, the one that reshapes everything the pastor believes about the timeline of events and the true intention behind the messages. Unlike the earlier letters, some yellowed by age, others smudged with soot or damp earth, this one stands out immediately. The ink is fresh, the paper crisp, and the date written at the top is the exact same day the pastor received the first letter delivered to the church doorstep. This realization sends a chill through him before he even finishes reading the opening line. If this letter was written the same day the first message reached him, it means the sisters anticipated not only that he would receive the letter but also that the church would attempt to destroy it. The tone of the final letter is markedly different from the rest. Where earlier ones expressed fear, pleading, and slow-growing desperation, this one reads with a grim certainty, as if the writer has finally accepted what is coming. Catherine McCrae describes the increasing boldness of the voices in the woods, how they no longer skirt the edges of the cabin but press against the walls, speaking in low, overlapping tones that grow clearer each night. She writes that the footsteps no longer retreat at dawn and that something, neither animal nor men, began tapping on the windows with what sounded like fingers. The most disturbing detail is her admission that one night she heard the church bell from miles away, ringing at an hour when the bell tower stood empty. It was a sound only she and her sister claimed to hear, one that echoed long after it should have faded. The letter warns that the church will try to bury them again, not with fire or graves but with silence, by ensuring their story dies before anyone can discover the truth of what they endured. She writes that if the letters are reaching him, it means the church has already taken steps to erase them permanently. She begs him not to trust the elders, explaining that the voices outside the cabin began the very night the church forced them into isolation. Whether the elders knew what lived in the woods or merely feared the sisters for their family's past, Catherine could never determine. But she insists that once the church decided they were a threat, the woods themselves seemed to respond, as though awakened by the fear and secrecy surrounding the sisters. The final paragraph carries a stark warning: if the sisters disappear and the church claims it as an act of God or an accident, the pastor must not believe them. She urges him to remember that stories buried in darkness do not stay buried forever, and that the woods surrounding Bear Hollow Ridge have a way of taking back what was hidden inside them. As he finishes reading, the pastor realizes that her message was not simply a cry for help but a final attempt to ensure the truth would survive even if she did not. The letter feels less like a farewell and more like a key handed to him in the last possible moment, unlocking a truth the church hoped no one would ever read again. When the investigator returns to the old clearing where the McCrae home once stood, the environment feels wrong, as though the woods are observing instead of being observed. The air carries the same descriptions the sisters wrote about: the low hum, the faint knocking, the feeling of being watched from above rather than around. It becomes clear that the McCrae's final nights weren't filled with hysteria but with a chilling certainty that something was coming for them. The last letter, half-scorched, describes how the church elders stood outside the cabin, praying loudly while refusing to enter, insisting the girls were claimed and beyond rescue. The investigator realizes the elders' prayers weren't for the girls but for themselves, terrified that whatever the sisters had encountered would spread if allowed to escape the cabin walls. As the investigator pieces together these final moments, it becomes impossible to ignore the fact that similar disappearances and unexplained noises have been reported near the ridge even in modern times. The pattern repeats across generations, always tied to the same stretch of woods that locals avoid without fully knowing why. With this understanding comes the realization that the McCrae sisters weren't victims of rumor or moral fear but of something far older, something that uses isolation and silence as weapons. Their final letter, written in trembling script, doesn't ask for rescue but warns anyone who finds it not to follow their footsteps into the woods, not to answer the voices calling from between the trees, and not to believe for a moment that those voices belong to anything human.